The most misunderstood panel in all of One Piece is this one. Yes, this one right here. I have never seen a panel as misunderstood and misinterpreted as this one when it comes to arguing or debating with fellow One Piece fans online about the inner workings of the series. That's right, you've kind of accidentally walked into a Shanks versus Mihawk video here. In this video, I want to explain how this panel has been misinterpreted so many times to the point where I think it is the most misinterpreted panel in the entirety of One Piece, and honestly, I don't think it comes close. Whenever I look online for One Piece arguments and debates, this is the single most misused panel in the entire story, at least in my experience. Now, when it comes to anything relating Shanks and Mihawk, bias is extremely relevant in these conversations and can very much impact the argument that someone is saying. So as a bit of ethos for this video, I guess, I should mention that I am a Shanks fan and I have multiple videos on this channel talking about how I think Shanks is the strongest character in the story. However, I'm going to do my absolute hardest to look at this panel objectively, push aside all of my bias, and explain from an objective standpoint why, from a writing perspective, this panel is extremely misunderstood. And I hope by the end of the video, both Shanks fans and Mihawk fans alike can agree that the use of this panel is kind of wrong. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you on the channel. And let's talk about this misunderstood panel. First of all, let's get some things about the context of this panel out of the way. I've seen a lot of people argue about Mihawk's title, actually myself included from one of my first videos on this channel, saying things like this is a title that the One Piece populace gave Mihawk, it's not Oda telling us he's the world's strongest swordsman. Now I want to make clear, I disagree with the past version of myself. I've come to realize that Oda is the person who gave Mihawk his title of the world's strongest swordsman. That is an ironclad title that cannot be refuted. It is Oda himself telling us that Mihawk possesses this title. The reason I'm mentioning that now is because this panel is different. I want you guys to look at the guy who is talking here in this entire scene, not just this one panel. This scene, of course, takes place after the abolition of the Seven Warlord system, and the world government has to determine what to unfreeze the prior warlords' bounties at, so they're trying to determine what bounties to give to Buggy and Mihawk. In the very same scene, very same chapter, a page before this panel that we're talking about, the person who is speaking in that panel says that Buggy is the mastermind who broke out of Impel Down, the mastermind behind Cross Guild, and strong enough to rein in both Mihawk and Crocodile. I'm sure you see where this is going, but he then goes on to say this line about Mihawk and Shanks, the line that we're going to be talking about in this video extensively. What I'm getting at here is that there is tons of misinformation in the inside world of One Piece. I'm not talking about misinformation that Oda is feeding us. I'm saying character dialogue specifically can be wrong and these characters can be misinformed. I'm not saying this guy who says this line about Mihawk and Shanks is 100% wrong, and I'm not invalidating what he's saying. It could very well be true. In fact, for the rest of this video, we're going to assume that he is telling the truth. But I do think it's important to just realize the bigger picture here. There are cases where people in the One Piece world say things that are incorrect. Literally a page before this panel, he is gassing up Buggy when Buggy did absolutely nothing. But now with some of the context and some important points out of the way, let's talk about what specifically is misunderstood about this panel and why so many people misuse it in arguments online. It all has to do with the wording of this sentence, and let me just read it out to you right now. His fellow former warlord, Hawkeye Mihawk, has even greater sword skills than the red-haired emperor. The use of this panel in online arguments I'm talking about is, of course, Shanks versus Mihawk, who is stronger. So many people have used this panel as an example of Oda outright telling us that Mihawk is stronger than Shanks and that there should be no argument. However, I think that this could not be further from the truth, especially with this panel. Again, let me just clarify, pushing my bias aside, I'm not saying that Shanks is stronger than Mihawk, Mihawk is stronger than Shanks. I think both of these things could be true. I just think, with the purpose of this video, at the very least, if you're going to argue for Mihawk, this should not be the panel that you use for your argument. Let me explain why. Again, the context and the phrasing of this panel is the most important. This is, again, a meeting where the world government is trying to determine the strength of Mihawk. And what is the first thing that this guy does in order to emphasize Mihawk's strength? He brings up Shanks. Using Shanks as your benchmark to say how strong Mihawk is does not fare well for his character. Just because they are outright saying that Mihawk has stronger sword skills than Shanks does not change the fact that they are comparing upwards here. If somebody were to find out about Eustace Captain Kidd and found out that their bounty was 3 billion, and they said, wow, his bounty's even on par with the Monkey D. Luffy, doesn't that say good things about both of these characters? Not that one is explicitly stronger than the other? Obviously, this example is about sword skills, which is extremely different, and we're going to get to that in a second, but the important part here is that Shanks is being used as a benchmark to compare Mihawk up to. It's as if the name Shanks elicits this feeling of, wow, Mihawk is on the same level or even greater than Shanks, that emperor who we all know is very strong. It just doesn't look good to use this panel to downscale Shanks, when his very existence as a character is what makes this line hard-hitting. But what everyone uses this panel for actually, and what seriously gets misused, is the explicit use of the phrase sword skills here. Now, the most common argument I see online is, Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman, Shanks uses a sword, therefore he is a swordsman, so Mihawk has to be stronger than Shanks. And that is a completely reasonable line of reasoning. However, if you're using this panel to display that argument, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. Why, in a moment of strength comparison, one of the only moments of strength comparison between these two characters in the whole series, would Oda choose to explicitly bring up swords and not overall strength? If this panel talked about strength in general, it would absolutely be the panel that Mihawk fans think they are using, but Oda choosing to specify here means that there is obviously more to the picture that he's leaving out. Yes, sword skills are probably a massive part of the pie chart that makes up these characters' strengths, so it is kind of valid to use sword skills as a measure of strength. However, because this panel singles in on sword skills alone, explicitly, without mentioning any other facets of these two characters' strength, does not bode well for Mihawk. If you're having trouble following what I'm saying, I'm going to use a sports analogy to explain it because I think it's a lot easier. Now, I'm a big hockey fan, so I'm going to use hockey players, but if you're using this argument for any of your friends, feel free to substitute it with, I don't know, football players, basketball players, soccer players. It really works with any example. The world government in this case is the NHL. There is a new player in the NHL who is extremely good, and his name is Connor Bedard. The NHL is trying to figure out how good this player actually is in order to value his contract or his marketing value or whatever you want to call it. They're trying to figure out how good he is. If you follow the NHL or know anything about hockey, Connor Bedard has a ridiculously good shot. He is a shooter. So, when the NHL goes to evaluate how good this player is, they say, well, he has an even better shot than Connor McDavid. This Connor McDavid I'm referring to, this new character in this analogy, is far and above the greatest hockey player on the planet right now, and every hockey fan would agree with that sentiment. The NHL saying Connor Bedard has a better shot than Connor McDavid is massive for Connor Bedard. It means he's a very good player to be compared to such a strong hockey player. However, this is the same forwards, upwards comparison that is happening in this Mihawk and Shanks panel. Just because Connor Bedard has a better shot than Connor McDavid doesn't mean you would say he's a better player than Connor McDavid. There are other facets of their game that are extremely important. And when you look at those, Connor McDavid is a better playmaker, a better defender, a better skater, has better hockey IQ, he's faster, he hits harder, literally everything under the sun here. Now let's revert this analogy back to Shanks and Mihawk. The world government saying here that Mihawk has better sword skills than Shanks is very good for his character. However, it's still an upwards comparison because Oda is deliberately leaving out other facets of their strength to highlight one facet specifically, swordsmanship. Just because Mihawk has better swordsmanship than Shanks does not include anything like his speed, his hockey, his endurance, his durability, his IQ. And while of course we don't know if all of these things are stronger than Mihawk because we have not seen either of them go all out, the fact that Oda chose specifically to mention swordsmanship here and nothing else does not look good for Mihawk. And it is why you should not use this panel as evidence for supporting Mihawk being stronger than Shanks, because they're comparing upwards here. Shanks is the benchmark, the pedestal that they're comparing or pushing Mihawk onto. Lastly, because this panel and the arguments that I'm making in this video have a lot to do with wording and phrasing specifically, I know there's going to be a lot of people saying that this is a translation and the original Japanese means Mihawk is stronger and that is what Oda intended to say. Well, let's take a look at the actual Japanese here. Did I study Japanese to find out who is stronger between Shanks and Mihawk? Yes. No, I'm kidding. I've been studying Japanese for a while, but it comes in handy for stuff like this. The original Japanese line is as follows. Moto o kashibukai ni shite, yonko akagami ni masaru kengi. Now, with my terrible pronunciation aside, I have left only the One Piece specific terms in kanji here. So Shichibukai obviously meaning 7 warlords, and Yonko obviously meaning emperor. And the rest is just in hiragana, so those of you who also know Japanese can read this along with me if you don't know kanji. Moto o kashichibukai, the former warlord. Nishite, about him. Yonko Akagami, obviously the red-haired emperor. Ni Masaru Kengi. has greater sword skill. There is nothing in Japanese here that specifies anything other than swordsmanship. The biggest word that I want to look at here is masaru. Now you can plug this word into any translator you'd like, but I plugged it into the translator that I have used for studying Japanese for like 4 years now, and the words that come out that I want to highlight are surpass, outrival, be superior, excel, and have an edge. In my opinion, this translation actually works really well with the relationship between Mihawk and Shanks, because it really shows that the dialogue is telling us that Mihawk's sword skill very slightly out-edges Shanks's, because we know they're very relative in strength because of their rivalry throughout their entire lives that Whitebeard tells us about. But this Japanese is not referring to anything other than swordsmanship, or kengi, at the end of this sentence. If you want to get really specific, kengi specifically refers to swordsmanship techniques. Things like named attacks, like think Zoro's Dragon Twister or Onigiri, stuff like that. Those are swords techniques. That is specifically what kengi is referring to. If it was just talking about swordsmanship in general, it would be kenjutsu or kendo. Now, quick detour, if you ask me specifically, kengi or swordsmanship in One Piece to me has always been these attacks that are specifically emphasized to be from a sword. Take any of the flying swordsmanship attacks, or very exaggerated cuts like Zoro cutting Pika, or Mihawk cutting the iceberg, or Zoro cutting the Onigashima horn. To me, that is kengi or swordsmanship, and if Divine Departure falls into that category, I am unsure of yet. But just wanted to give a little bit of insight on what I think kengi is in One Piece. End of the detour there. But regardless, even if I am wrong, it is inarguable that kengi specifically refers to swordsmanship skills here, or being a swordsman. Once again, this line of dialogue does the same thing that it does in English, specifically and explicitly mentions swordsmanship, nothing about greater strength, overall strength, or strength levels. And that is why I think this is the most misunderstood panel in One Piece. I think it is completely valid to say Mihawk is stronger than Shanks. I think it's completely valid to say Shanks is stronger than Mihawk, because that's what I personally believe. However, don't use this panel for Mihawk gas. I love the Shanks versus Mihawk debate. I think it's all in good fun, and I think it's one of the most engaging conversations in the One Piece fandom because it has no correct answer as of now. And because I like having that debate, Mihawk fans, I pray to you, use better material. Do not use this panel to gas up Mihawk like I just said. There is a plethora of other panels and other things in the story that really help that argument to Mihawk being stronger than Shanks. This is not one of them at all. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. If you're a Mihawk fan, Shanks fan, whatever you are, I really hope that you could appreciate this analysis from a non-biased perspective, or even from a biased perspective, and just came to understand that from a writing perspective, it's not the greatest way to buff up Mihawk's stocks. If you enjoyed this video, I'd super appreciate it if you could subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm willing to respond to any agreements, arguments, whatever you have to say. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.